Hello, I'm Paul B. It was suggested I provide you with a perspective on ports and federal policy. And since I'm no historian and we have only an hour, we'll cover only the last, say, 40 years. I'll also limit the range of policy matters that I covered. There are areas that I won't be able to cover in order to avoid making this review feel like it's taking 40 years. In the process, I hope you will gain a little insight into how the changes, and evolution really, occurred in the port maritime sector were reflected in federal policy and how developments in policy affected ports, principally the coastal ports. In the time I'm with you, I'll review why me, meaning why ask me to talk on this subject. I will go over some of the political and policy context of recent decades. I will go over the relationship between ports and the government, how port-related federal policies have evolved, how port activity in Washington, D.C. has evolved, and some of the issues that ports and the federal government may or should address in the next years. As to my background, I work in Washington, D.C. as a lobbyist, an advisor on policy and port and policy, other policy matters. At the end of my slides, you'll see an online address for me, in case that's of any use to you. I've worked in and around the federal government since the early 70s, and specifically on port and related transportation matters for nearly 40 of those years. My most formative experiences were working on Capitol Hill and later, for 25 years, running the Washington office of the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey until I retired and started consulting full-time. Over these years, now I'd like to talk about these years that I've referred to. Now, it'll provide a bit of a context. I've been able to witness significant changes in the conduct and approach of government brought about by change agents like Reagan, Clinton, Obama, and yes, Trump on matters such as regulation, defense, infrastructure, spending, and trade. I've witnessed the gradual transformation of politics in Washington from generally bipartisan and collegial, pre-Watergate, a time that I'm guessing you're too young to have consciously enjoyed, to the us versus them partisanship in Congress, championed notably by Newt Gingrich in the 90s, that's since then morphed into the hyper-partisanship and increasing distrust in politics today. And in case it need be said, I make no partisan statements here or in the rest of this lecture. The political environment here in Washington and in the states has changed quite a lot over these decades. Okay, so moving on. When I refer to policy in this context, I broadly refer to the laws created by Congress, signed by the President, and implemented through rules developed in the departments and agencies to implement the law. Policy also could be a particular policy direction that was set by a president for his administration. Policy makers, generally, are the elected persons, aided by staff and issue experts, and it should be said, influenced by interest groups. As you may know, one port is not identical to another. Ports vary in size, mix of cargo, geography, volume of cargo, operating responsibility, and port governance. Despite those differences and the active competing among ports, when it comes to Washington, D.C., most port authorities engage in policy matters through the American Association of Port Authorities, the AAPA. The trade group for marine terminal operators and stevedores is the National Association of Waterfront Employers. Some ports, terminals, and trade groups also seek additional assistance by hiring persons with government experience. I was a full-time employee for the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey in Washington but most port reps are lobbyists with multiple clients, which is my current practice. As you might expect, port lobbyists at times collaborate with each other. In 1985, I formed something called the Washington Port Reps. I wanted to know who else was working on port issues. We could exchange information, collaborate where it made sense. It must have been a good idea. The port reps still meet today. One last point. I found working for a port authority to be a great learning experience about the commercial side, the commercial sector, even though, being in Washington, I was not intimately involved in the working port. Whether you work for the public port authority in Savannah, Corpus Christi, or New York Harbor, you work with one foot planted in the private sector. Many or most public servants don't get to learn from that kind of broad experience. Okay, that's enough background. Let's start talking policy and some changes that have taken place in the policy and port sectors. I'd like to note some policy markers in the 40-year timeline I mentioned. In that time, there have been many changes in policy, including some important landmark laws. These certainly capture major policy developments, if not represent all that I could mention. Among the themes that these represent are a shift to environment protection, deregulation, and multimodal infrastructure. I'll start with one outside the 40-year framework. Coastal Zone Management Act of '72 encouraged states to prepare and implement coastal zone management plans. The Motor Carrier Act and the Staggers Rail Act, both of 1980, deregulated trucking and railroads, bringing about greater competition in freight services. The Clean Water Act of '86 is the rule book for regulating and ending sources of pollution and empowering states to set higher standards beyond those of the federal government. The Water Resources Development Act of '86 established new rules for cost sharing in civil works projects, created user fees to cover costs of channel projects, and broke a 10-year logjam holding back federal dredging and other water resource projects. The Intermodal Surface Transportation Efficiency Act, lovingly called ICE-T, blazed a new path for road and public transportation policy. It established regional planning entities, and it introduced intermodalism to federal transportation law. The Ocean Shipping Reform Act of '98 established a new regulatory environment for ocean shipping. The Maritime Transportation Security Act of 2002 established a security regime around port and ocean shipping activity in the wake of September 11th. The Fixing America Surface Transportation Act of 2015, otherwise known as the FAST Act, includes major freight transportation policy, planning, and programs. Finally, I want to note a non-legislative policy development in 1999, recognizing the existence of the marine transportation system, but more on that later. Of course, the port maritime sector has seen great changes in recent decades. By the late 70s, containerization had a solid grip on international trade, and the term globalization took hold. Intermodal facilities and equipment would become increasingly essential to port operations. In the 1980s, the Pacific trade blossomed, and so did West Coast ports, especially Los Angeles and Long Beach. No longer was my home port of New York Harbor king of the hill. Booming Asian industry and exports made LA and Long Beach the top two American ports as measured in TEUs. Asian trade volumes inspired developments in logistics, such as the invention of double stacking of containers in intermodal rail service. U.S. ports grew as global trade grew, and with that, the economic value of ports to their states and localities also grew. Starting in the mid-'80s, the nation's capital saw the role and self-interest of ports in federal policy evolve from passive to active. The government, port stakeholders decided could be more useful. Continuing with changes to the industry, ships were growing in size, and that meant Congress had to authorize and fund deeper and wider channels. The Corps of Engineers had to work with a greater sense of urgency and efficiency. Terminals had to be modified for larger ships and cargo volumes. The interstates and state and local roadways needed to connect better, and roadways to the terminals had to improve. Intermodal rail yards needed to be closer to ports, and eventually the rails themselves had to be brought to and even on the terminals. And ports and their terminals had to achieve greater efficiency and productivity or risk not attracting business. In the early 2000s, the Port of Savannah became a fast-growing gateway in large part by adopting a strategy of attracting company distribution centers and their freight to Georgia. Savannah's ascendance to being the second busiest Atlantic port today was inevitable. And as we have seen, other ports on the South Atlantic coast have been determined not to be left out of the large ship race. As far as U.S. ports were concerned, the government had to be responsive to their needs, and it had to learn how ports and the freight system operated. The commercial freight system was continuing to transform. Government agencies and federal policy were not keeping up with the commercial sector. So, out of necessity, port stakeholders and cargo interests became more active lobbying in Washington. And as I noted earlier, a large part of the lobbying had to be the education of policymakers. Keep in mind, elections happen every 2 years, and that can mean novices enter Congress with little or no understanding of parts of the economy that are not around the state or their district. Ports, trade, freight logistics, and federal policy evolved over recent decades. So did the government's involvement in ports and on the terminals. Of course, the average individual and entity, whether public or private sector, isn't necessarily pleased when the federal government is playing in its sandbox. Rules, regulations, taxes, you name it. However, Washington has been in ports since the formation of this country. 4 agencies that stand out are the Coast Guard, Customs Service, the Federal Maritime Commission, and the Army Corps of Engineers. The Customs Service collected the first national revenue in ports by putting tariffs on import cargo. It provided protection for American producers and money for national defense and other functions of the young government. Customs revenue actually remained the dominant source of national revenue until the newly enacted federal income tax was collected around 100 years ago. The Federal Maritime Commission was created in 1961, but the regulation of shipping really was practiced starting around the First World War. Port authority and terminal agreements are among the regulated activities. Meanwhile, the Coast Guard's original life-saving mission was broadened in the 20th century to regulate maritime safety, navigation, and security. Of course, the Army Corps of Engineers Navigation Channel Program is the mission on which port activity has most relied. The Corps was charged to clear rivers for shipping as early as the 18th century. Few ports can do without the Federal Navigation Program today. When in 1967, the U.S. Department of Transportation opened its doors, the Coast Guard was the department's principal maritime component. The other was the St. Lawrence Seaway Development Corporation. The Maritime Administration, or MARAD, finally entered the department in 1981, and even then, MARAD's mission was to promote the U.S. Merchant Marine. The federal interest in the operation and infrastructure of ports was left principally to the Federal Maritime Commission in the first instance, and the Corps of Engineers. Now here's a bit of trivia. When the formation of the Department of Transportation was being debated by policymakers in the 60s, there was some thought given to including the Corps of Engineers navigation program. Anyway, the most recent government organizational change affecting ports occurred with the formation of the Homeland Security Department. By being literally on the waterfront and playing the essential role of connecting ships to land transportation, ports are in the maritime world. Let me say that a little more clearly. By being literally on the waterfront and playing the essential role of connecting ships to the land transportation, ports are in the maritime world. You and I would probably agree on that. But it's my sense that it really wasn't until the 1990s, during the Clinton administration, that the Department of Transportation started to show increased interest in ports, how they operated, and the state of their infrastructure. On encouragement from some prominent organizations and persons, including Lillian Barone, who you may meet in the weeks ahead, U.S. DOT started looking at the maritime sector and how ocean cargo moved from one point in the supply chain to the next. Secretary Rodney Slater convened listening sessions in port cities, followed by a national conference with private and public sector stakeholders and other transportation experts to develop what would be a vision for the marine transportation system, a vision that until then had been lacking. In fact, I had not heard of the phrase marine transportation system until Slater's Department of Transportation undertook this effort. When in 1999, and I need to change my slide here, Secretary Slater sent his report to Congress, an assessment of the U.S. marine transportation system, it documented the connected system and triggered a new awareness of something that had been known only by its parts. Policymakers understood vessels, they understood ports to some extent, terminals probably even to a lesser extent, and they certainly understood the related trucking and rail infrastructure and services. But they understood that as modally individual parts and facilities. What Slater's report did was shine the light on a connected system. The marine transportation system, the MTS, extends inland. It consists of waterways, ports, and intermodal landside connections that land modes follow to move people and the export and import cargo to and from U.S. ports. Among the recommendations included in the 1999 report was the creation of a Marine Transportation System National Advisory Council, MTSNAC, to give stakeholders a formal advisory role for DOT. The report also recommended the formation of a federal interagency committee on the marine transportation system to provide coordination among the federal departments and agencies that have roles and responsibilities having to do with the MTS. Both were created by Secretary Slater. In later years, the Interagency Committee was reformulated and established in law by Congress. What is the CMTS, the Committee on the Marine Transportation System, may sound like yet another bureaucratic reason for holding more meetings, but it was a useful addition, and it still is, to the federal government's organizational chart. It would be nice to think that there's a single maritime-related agency in the government, but there are 14 federal departments and independent agencies with some level of interest in MTS matters. Moreover, they have responsibility for 79 programs and functions that pertain to the MTS. You can appreciate that when, for example, 20 agencies have a role in MTS-related environmental issues. A coordinating committee can come in handy. The federal government came to recognize that the commercial sector already knew. The supply chain will be as good as the condition of its links. Federal surface transportation policy and programs had been about building the interstate highway system. But by the mid-90s, the system was, for all practical purposes, built. As for railroads, the government had played its part in the previous century by granting land for the building of rail lines as the nation expanded. But in the 1990s, trucking and railroads of the freight system saw the need for the government to take infrastructure policy to a new level that matched the commercial system, and so did ports. Meanwhile, great volumes of cargo were being unloaded at the major gateways only to encounter choke points along the road and rail routes. The landside system wasn't ready to take on the demand flowing inland to the Midwest. And not a lot was being done to fix those problems. So what happened? Importers and retailers also got in the act. Previously, the retailers whose shelves were filled with foreign-made items showed little interest in getting involved in highway and other freight infrastructure projects. But now they were getting impatient. Nike, Target, and others in the retail business organized something called the Waterfront Coalition. They made the case for improving the freight system, or at least that part of the system where their goods traveled. It meant real money to those companies that their imported goods made it to the shelves in time. Waterfront Coalition members sent company logisticians and executives to the marine terminals to learn how they operate and what terminal improvements were planned. They talked about their cargo needs. The coalition also gathered information as to where along the truck routes and the rail corridors new highway interchanges or lanes or rail hub improvements were needed in order to shave hours and days off the time it took for their goods to get to, say, Chicago. And the coalition started lobbying in Washington and state capitals like Sacramento, where they pushed to have choke points eliminated and clean drayage trucking emissions and drayage trucking emissions cleaned up. The combined efforts of the shippers, ports, and other freight lobby interests served to educate policymakers on the freight system needs. Meanwhile, coalition efforts grew. The Freight Stakeholders Coalition, led by the AAPA and a group called IANA, has lobbied for 15 or more years for freight infrastructure improvement funding programs. Many years of effort were rewarded in 2015 when President Obama signed the FAST Act. Among its many freight-related provisions were mandating the development of state freight improvement plans and creating a new grant program for highway, railroad, and port-related improvements. Significantly, port authorities were made eligible for both the new and existing programs. Then in 2001, we saw a major change in how the federal government figured into port operations. Up until then, and perhaps except for times of global war, port security usually was defined in terms of preventing trespassing, smuggling, and cargo theft. Gaining access to a terminal in many ports really wasn't difficult. Not every port had fencing, although resting cargo and containers usually were secured. Then came September 11th. Security took on an urgent meaning that ports and shipping, like airports and aircraft, could be avenues for attacks on the country. Congress quickly wanted to understand the extent of the nation's vulnerability to terrorism, including through our ports and coastline. They learned the immensity of the challenge. Port agencies and marine terminal operators were among the supply chain stakeholders engaged in discussions with the Coast Guard, with the Customs Service, and the Department of Transportation as to how the federal government should respond. The MITSNAC advisory panel provided a good forum for stakeholders and the federal agencies to identify issues and discuss solutions. The challenge was to build a new system of vessel, cargo, and terminal security, while hampering the flow of commerce as little as possible. Port authorities appreciated the necessity for new security rules for tighter fence lines, lighting, cameras, and screening persons with access to the terminals. But that would cost money. Ports and terminals lobbied to have the federal government pony up a share of the costs. After all, this became a matter of national security, not just a local crime prevention. The federal government really needed to participate in the cost. The Maritime Transportation Security Act was followed 4 years later by the Safe Port Act. The two laws set forth requirements for security risk assessments, port and vessel security planning, domestic and overseas cargo screening and inspection, TWIC cards and readers, among other things. Congress also established the Port Security Grants Program, authorizing $400 million a year in funding. Port Security Grants may have been the first grant program designed principally for ports and terminals. It's noteworthy that the port authorities and terminal operators were seeking federal money for improvements inside the terminal gates. Now, you might think that the federal money had always been welcome to help improve port terminals. Not so. For a long time, the line was drawn at the terminal gate. Reasons included a reluctance to deal with the strings attached to federal money, as well as the notion that the federal government would be in a position to pick winners and losers. Some port people pointed to the port preference clause in the U.S. Constitution. No preference, it says, no preference would be given by regulation or revenue to the ports of one state over those of another. But from the perspective of the Supreme Court, it wasn't a blanket prohibition. The court saw no reason why the government should not provide incidental preferences that could help, or for that matter, disadvantage a port. As we know, ports have a long history of being helped through the Corps of Engineers Channel Program, and federally funded road projects leading to the terminals were always appreciated. But for inside the gate, for the most part, no. The American Association of Port Authorities reflected the traditional view of its members. Ports compete for business. Gantry cranes, courtesy of Washington, could give an advantage. But not surprisingly, some of its members were perfectly happy to have the government help defray the cost of steel, concrete, and equipment. After the issue was debated within the association, the AAPA had a new policy that welcomed federal assistance inside the terminal. The thinking was that all port authorities should be eligible to vie on a level playing field for the grants. Even as ports were warming to the idea of federal money, it helped that the government itself was prepared to put infrastructure money into ports. Thank the Great Recession of 2008, when the financial system and economy tanked. In 2009, 1 month into the new Obama administration, Congress passed a contentiously debated stimulus program, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. It included what was a transformational grant program for transportation infrastructure, with the acronym TIGER. Among other things, project proposals had to demonstrate a positive benefit-cost ratio, and for the first time, port projects were eligible to compete for millions of dollars in competitive grants. Freight-related projects were very competitive. Each year since 2009, as many as 8 port projects have been awarded as much as $30 million. The TIGER program, now called BUILD, broke the ice for landside infrastructure spending in ports. More ice was broken in 2015 when Congress created the Fast Lane Grants Program, or now called INFRA, exclusively for freight-related projects. $4.5 billion was provided to be spent over 5 years, mostly for highway projects. But $500 million of that was set aside for intermodal projects, including ports. Since the first grant awards of 2009, coastal and inland port projects have been awarded close to $900 million for everything from rail extensions and new gates to piling repair and wharf strengthening. Earlier this month, a Senate committee approved a proposal for a new infrastructure program exclusively for ports and port-related intermodal projects. But more on that shortly. So, in a matter of a few decades, port stakeholders worked to educate the policymakers and government agencies as to the mission and function of ports. Port users, especially the beneficial cargo owners and exporters, effectively highlighted the need for ports and terminals, along with other freight infrastructure, to be modern and efficient. Port stakeholders became key actors in Washington on a range of freight infrastructure issues. And policymakers came to recognize the essential role ports play in the global supply chain and in domestic job creation. And federal policy adjusted accordingly. As a transportation policy writer noted in an article just last week, the federal government surely has not left ports behind. Now, you may have noticed that I use terms ports, port authorities, and marine terminal operators. People often use port as shorthand for the public agency or in reference to a marine terminal. You probably have your own way of labeling, consciously or unconsciously. In my work, speaking with policymakers and others around government, I do it for clarity purposes. I use those three terms as much as I am able to remember to do for clarity purposes. I refer to the port, the physical and geographic location, the port authority, that is to say the public entity which may or may not operate the terminals, and the marine terminal operator, a company that invests in and operates the terminal. There are distinctions to be made, and such clarity can be important in helping others understand the sector, especially when it comes to the roles of the public and private sector roles. People in Washington often assume port authorities do it all, invest in, serve customers at, and operate the terminals. And sometimes that's the case. However, more often the private sector companies play those roles, either as fully controlling marine terminal operators, MTOs, with the long-term leases, or as stevedores hired by the landlord operator. If a senator's staff is looking for stakeholder input for a draft bill involving port operations, you want that staffer to reach out to both Port Authority and terminal industry representatives. And always keep in mind that there's no better educational tool than for a government person, especially one who is a novice on port matters, to be invited onto the terminal, to stand under a gantry crane alongside a ship, to talk to workers, and to get a view of a working port. So, what does the future hold for ports and government policy? Annual funding of programs will always be on the agenda, but I'd like to mention a few other matters that the government may or should give its attention to over the coming months and the next years. First, how can landside improvements be afforded for ports to stay competitive and sustainable? Freight grants is one way. Opponents of the Tiger Grants program tried and failed to kill it. Today, the build and infra programs continue to be funded for a total of $1 and $2 billion a year. I don't see that changing anytime soon, but it will require an annual effort to ensure the programs and strong levels of funding are in place. And that annual effort can include the port authorities, the terminals, general contractors, and other parties in the freight system. The Consolidated Rail Infrastructure and Safety Improvements Program is a possible source of funding, although that program is less associated with port rail needs. AAPA members have identified more than $20 billion in projected multimodal port and rail access needs in the next decade. The fact is that ports with projects should try to secure what they can from these programs. The freight-focused infra program has one major weakness as far as ports are concerned. Only 20% of its total funding, and remember that was $4.5 billion over 5 years, is open to port and intermodal projects. Only $500 million is open to port and other projects that are multimodal. The rest goes to highways. All freight projects, single and multimodal, should be made eligible for the full infra program. All right, now let's talk tax policy. Maintaining favorable tax policy is always a priority for port authorities and other governmental entities that rely on tax-exempt public financing tools for improvement projects. Port authorities are on the watch for any threat to weaken that aspect of tax policy, such as arose last year in Congress. Another infrastructure incentive is the short line tax credit, 5G, that helps the financing of projects to preserve rails that are off the main lines and serve ports and other facilities. Advocates want it made a permanent tax credit. New initiatives. Now, I mentioned earlier that a new port grants program has been proposed by Senator Roger Wicker of Mississippi, the Port Operations Research and Technology Act, the PORT Act. It's funny how legislators like to really work on their bill names in order to make them sound like they mean what they mean. Anyway, the purpose is to provide funding for improving the safety, efficiency, or reliability of goods movement through ports and intermodal connectors. It's not a big money bill, but it can be a useful step toward a larger program. Meanwhile, Chairman Bill Schuster of Pennsylvania, he chairs the House Transportation Committee, who had hoped to push a major new infrastructure bill through in this last year that he's going to be in Congress, instead has unveiled a draft bill mostly aimed at largely at fixing the Highway Trust Fund, but also the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund. Other bills were introduced, including a bipartisan Senate bill to create an infrastructure financing authority. Yes, there are proposals, including the Trump infrastructure package, but there's really not enough time, energy, or budgetary resources remaining in this Congress to give them a go. And this Congress comes to a close at the end of the year. Here's another question. How can we fix the navigation channel program? The Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund is the first and most important item. The Federal Navigation Program is 40% of the fiscal 2019 Army Corps of Engineers Civil Works proposed budget. Coastal navigation alone was appropriated nearly $1.8 billion for the current year, FY18. Nearly $1.4 billion of that was for channel maintenance dredging. The Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund was created to account for harbor maintenance tax revenue, which is collected mostly on import cargo to pay for channel maintenance. Despite many unmet channel needs in our ports, Congress does not spend all that is collected on dredging, and instead redirects hundreds of millions of dollars to other purposes. For decades, ports have lobbied to have the full tax collection allocated annually for maintenance. Some progress has been made toward that goal, but the effort will have to continue for a complete fix. Another issue is project delivery. Now, the Civil Works project involved in getting a channel deepening or other improvements approved and funded is maddeningly long and expensive. Projects can take more than 20 years to be evaluated, planned, designed, funded, and constructed. That was true in the 1980s, and it remains true. There are exceptions, of course, but there is a huge backlog in port projects. Congress and the Corps of Engineers are in the position to shorten the process. Port stakeholders will continue to press for effective streamlining of procedures and regulations. Another issue is what I label self-help. As of 2014, the backlog of authorized projects, like I said, including navigation, that awaited construction funding numbered around 1,000 for an estimated $62 billion. Each year, only a few new projects are funded to start construction, while others wait years to be put into the budget. Port authorities and states, Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina being current examples, are choosing not to wait. They're advancing money, often hundreds of millions of dollars, for the federal share of the project, in addition to their non-federal share of project costs. Congress has responded to that impatience by gradually allowing the non-federal sponsors to take on more of the traditional federal role. That trend will continue, and Congress should reduce the red tape that is involved. Ports must stay competitive and make infrastructure improvements at a pace that suits the marketplace, not the federal government. One other Corps of Engineers issue I'll raise, and that's where the future home of the Civil Works program will be. For years, there's been talk of moving the Civil Works program out of the Pentagon, where it is a minor part of the nation's Defense Department. The Army Corps is trusted but considered slow, costly, and bureaucratic. Key members of Congress, and most recently the White House, have proposed moving the navigation program to the U.S. Department of Transportation. Reorganizing the federal government is difficult to accomplish, but I expect this issue is not going to go away, and it probably shouldn't. Whether moving to DOT will make it a really good process, I don't know. What will port and navigation stakeholders say about the idea? I'm not sure about that either. Some will want it to stay where it is, while others definitely would like to see it move. Okay, here's another question. How will the mandate for security inform terminal operations? Now, the TWIC program was created after the attacks of September 11th, like I mentioned. Port and maritime workers must undergo background checks and carry the TWIC card for entry to terminals. TWIC was to have been the first step in requiring security cards for most all transportation workers. Biometric card readers also were to be installed at terminal gates, promising a better way to keep track of who is inside the gate. Plus, it would be more efficient in processing people. But TWIC has had its share of critics, as has the Coast Guard's proposed reader regulation. Congress awaits a full assessment of the TWIC program and a report by the Department of Homeland Security. This question of how well the program is working and what is its future will be before Congress for the next few years. Port stakeholders will need to participate in the discussion that will ensue. Then there's security grants. The Port Security Grant Program will continue to be a needed source of funds to help pay for a range of security measures, including cybersecurity, in order to meet federal requirements. Port stakeholders will continue to advocate for the grants program and hope to convince Congress to maintain its funding. So what new business can be brought to the port? Now, the federal government doesn't necessarily have a lot of authority, perhaps nor should it, as far as bringing new business to ports. But the marine highway issue is a unique issue and one that I'm particularly interested in. Ports are economic engines, charged by their cities and states to bring about economic development. Any number of things could result in a decrease in trade and cargo volume. The Marine Highway Program is intended to boost domestic freight transportation on U.S. waterways. Revising federal policies could incentivize the use of marine transportation, help new port markets, and provide benefits on multiple levels. Excuse me for a minute. Transportation. I'll give you three areas where there are benefits and hurdles. Congested highways slow freight. Coastal and inland waterway routes are underutilized, but federal policy and resources favor land modes and do little to incentivize new water services. Now, shipyards. Domestic cargo moves require Jones Act qualified vessels. More would have to be built to serve new business. Where would the financing come for those ships if the marine highway market is not proven? Getting private financing would be difficult if you're asking banks to take a risk. And job creation. Besides giving work to the shipbuilding industry, Jones Act vessels require U.S. crews. Will the Maritime Union support changes in policy, perhaps even relating to the Jones Act? Now, there certainly are potential benefits of marine highway development, but also significant policy and political hurdles to overcome. And by the way, I'm not suggesting that the Jones Act be eliminated, not at all. But that's one of the issues, the hot issues, that has been in the background and sometimes in the foreground. The creation of the Marine Highway Program in 2007 and the funding of small marine highway grants must be followed with more substantial policy action if marine highway activity is to grow. Small and medium-sized ports are especially interested in this. And give me a minute here. I've lost my PowerPoint. Okay, let me get to where we need to be. Okay. Another issue. How can port productivity data be collected and evaluated in the interest of assessing the condition and performance of an important part of the marine transportation system? In reaction to congestion conditions in some major gateways and the slowing of cargo in West Coast ports around the time of contract talks, cargo interests convinced Congress to do something. The Port Performance Freight Statistics Program was created. It requires the Department of Transportation to collect performance data on the top 25 ports as measured in TEUs, in cargo tonnage, and dry bulk volume, and to report those results to Congress. Shippers and agriculture exporters want uniform metrics used in order to reveal those ports that are more efficient and productive. Shippers thought the airing of data would convince ports to improve performance in order to get their data. In order to get their cargo. Marine terminals, port authorities, and longshore workers objected to that approach. They insisted that no data be used to allow competing ports to be judged against the other. By the way, little in the way of uniform metrics is employed across the country in the industry. Nearly 50 ports made the final list, and 2 annual reports, the coverage shown there on your screen, amount to little more than statistical profiles. They're nice reports. It has some good information in it, but it's not necessarily what the cargo interests had hoped to get. The Senate committee has asked DOT and the Maritime Administration to come up with another approach. So-called condition and performance reports are prepared on other parts of the transportation system, but there's not one in the maritime system. A dialogue among port stakeholders and the department will commence later this month. Is there a way of assessing the performance of port-related freight movement? That's a big question. Now, I'm going to conclude with something, and I, in my research preparing this lecture for you, I found something that was interesting. In the 1999 USDOT report that formally defined the marine transportation system, there was this interesting vision statement that seems an appropriate and timely way to conclude this lecture. The task force members at the Marine Transportation System National Conference adopted the following vision statement using a 20-year horizon. As you can see, it says, what is the desired state of the MTS in 2020, which of course is now just less than 2 years away? The U.S. marine transportation system will be the world's most technologically advanced, safe, secure, efficient, effective, accessible, globally competitive, dynamic, and environmentally responsible system for moving goods and people. Well, we've made a lot of progress over these last years, but it looks like we still have a lot to do in the coming years. And as an illustration, I'll end with a favorite image that I borrowed several years ago from a certain railroad's TV commercial. It showed how, by moving freight on rail, the highway can be free of trucks and congestion. However, what it also illustrated, though this wasn't the intention of the railroad, is how the waterway, a marine highway, was not being used and having capacity to spare. I hope you find some part of this lecture interesting and useful. Good luck in your work.
Thank you, Paul. That was excellent. I have a question for you, if that's okay.
Yep.
We've been talking about transportation, freight transportation policy at the federal level. Does the lack of one hurt our nation's interest in achieving the goal that the administration just showed? You see positive elements development of a national policy.
And you were a little bit garbled in this, a national maritime policy?
A national freight
policy. I think it's potentially beneficial. Certainly the freight, and I think I'm answering your question, the freight community here in DC, representing the larger industry, including ports, have taken the view that a national freight policy is essential. And your question reminds me of something that I probably should have also included, and that is that there is in development at USDOT a national maritime transportation strategy. These are documents that could easily end up just sitting on the shelf collecting dust, but they also can be used, in particular by Congress, if not an administration, as the way to start building some new program or new policy. So I think it's really important. Things happen in government not just because an American Association of Port Authorities or a National Association of Waterfront Employers or the American Trucking Associations lobby and want it. Most good policy is developed because there's a lot of information that's developed as a foundation for that a new policy or a change in policy. So I think it's really important that it happen. Understanding the freight system as much as possible is really important. That's why Congress has told DOT to essentially map the freight system and make some judgments as to what routes are important parts of the freight system.
I'm sorry, my audience is a little garbled, but perhaps a related question. In the absence of national proactive freight or maritime policy program, we're seeing big regionalization in terms of transportation networks, understanding that ways represented by the ports are vital, need to be connected water side and side to assure the vitality and vibrancy of the region. Are you seeing in that context an interest in privatization of ports? It is, as you mentioned, very much a public-private partnership throughout all elements. Clearly, with the predilection of many in Congress to see privatization, and I think that's also a state issue. Wondering if that initiative is at all surface.
Well, I mean, privatization itself, I haven't heard that in a long time, but that actually is a phrase and a theme that emerged in the 1990s, around the time that Ronald Reagan came into office. I remember a New York governor being hot to trot on that as well. Privatizing public entities is, and usually those would be corporate entities, something like a port authority or an airport authority or a housing authority, was something that some parts of the political system thought would be a great idea, and to a very great extent it didn't happen. You still have, there still is a lot of discussion certainly about something called P3s, the public-private partnerships, and some people in Congress have been pushing that in a lot of different ways, and that's not a bad thing, but there are a lot of ifs and problems there. Ports, for example, are great models in many respects for public-private partnerships. The Port Authority is working with a terminal operator or with a builder, a terminal operator to run their port facilities, a builder to design and run a toll bridge or a toll road for the state or the municipality. These things can work, but there are ways that they don't really work well. I mean, in one way that the Corps of Engineers has had a lot of trouble figuring out how to incorporate P3 arrangements in the navigation program or in other aspects of the Civil Works Water Resources program. This works perhaps more naturally in certain sectors than it does in others. But yes, there'll continue to be that interest in seeing what the private sector can do, both because some policymakers just like the notion of government doing less and business doing more, and others that simply are interested in finding efficiencies wherever they can.
And the Corps of Engineers itself is a project of increasing attention and understanding that the notion of transferring functions from the Department of Transportation to achieve how greater efficiencies, but there's also a notion the revenue stream that's going through the HMT would facilitate a privatization of the revenue stream. That's not progressed as far as I can tell, but you're closer to that.
Well, no, it's not progressing, and I'm not ready to say that it's going to go away. To be honest with you, early on, I thought that the reorganization proposal that the Trump White House sent to Congress, which included the Corps of Engineers Civil Works program, was in many respects likely just to be forgotten and fade away. And I did that because, as you know, as in just about any organization, a great amount of inertia builds up if you have, in this case, the Corps of Engineers in the Department of the Army, or the Civil Works program is not necessarily part of the military, the Defense Department mission, but the fact of the matter is that it does provide some benefit to the military side in terms of keeping the engineers involved in a lot of challenging projects. I think that there will continue to be efforts to do something. Certainly, if the Republicans control Congress, that will continue to be something that will be looked at. But oftentimes, much of what also gets proposed, and certainly gets the headlines, are some of the more controversial proposals, eliminating the Department of Education. And that oftentimes falls along ideological lines, and it's difficult to see how some of those proposals will win. Now, to what extent does it make sense for the Corps of Engineers to go over to the Department of Transportation, at least the navigation part of the Civil Works program? On one level, you can understand it, but you also have to think that it may require a major transformation in how the Civil Works program is conducted. Who's responsible for doing these projects? Will it be the Department of Transportation that gets flooded with engineers from the Corps of Engineers? Maybe not. Maybe all of a sudden all these projects will be handed off to private sector companies to accomplish. And the Department of Transportation will simply be a conduit for money and a regulator of some sort. That will take a lot of effort to design and to implement, and it'll require patience on part of a lot of people. Whether ultimately it will happen, I don't know.
No, things happen slowly in DC for the most part, but
yeah,
the lack of ideological bent on the part of the port industry will continue. Long maintain our politics, our port politics, and they are not bound to either party, but by both interest in economic development, quality of life, and security, and hopefully that will continue to guide policy in our nation's capital.
Yep.
Thank you, Paul. I very much appreciate you taking the time and your expertise and experience providing a very comprehensive, thorough, and expert policies over the last years.
Well, I just hope it didn't feel like 40 years listening to it.
I had a great time listening.
Goodbye. Good luck, everyone.